Everyone ran from her deadly pet, but a human made her feel love. Outpost 17 wasn't built for company, and certainly not for anything like her. It clung to the edge of known space like a rusted scar, where the Federation dumped everything it didn't want to deal with. Failed experiments, dishonorably discharged soldiers, scavengers with too much history and too little restraint, and drifters who'd fallen between the cracks of civilization like ash through an old air filter. The place stank of oil and tension, with narrow corridors lit by flickering plasma bulbs and walls so thin that arguments, sobbing, or the rhythmic clang of maintenance work carried like whispers through a morgue. That day began like any other. Kalen Dunn stood beneath a corroded bulkhead in Bay C, elbows deep in the guts of a defunct skimmer, the same way he had for months. Exiled from Federation service after refusing to fire on civilians during the Rion blockade, reduced to fixing fuel lines and pretending the ache in his chest was just heartburn, not regret. The station was dead quiet, unusually so, even for a crew that knew better than to make noise where there was no warmth to echo it. Then the airlock hissed. Kalen didn't look up at first, too focused on stripping insulation from a bypass conduit. But the silence thickened into something unnatural, like the vacuum just outside had seeped into the hallway. He heard boots, slow, deliberate, too soft to belong to a soldier, too heavy to be civilian, and then the low, unplaceable growl that stopped every hand mid-motion and froze even the ex-pirate medic who never blinked at blood. Kalen glanced toward the docking corridor and saw her, tall, unnaturally tall, not in the genetically modified way that smugglers sometimes went for, but like her bones had grown in low gravity and never fully readjusted. Her armor wasn't sleek or militaristic, but rough, mismatched, and practical. Jet black plates riddled with impact burns, fabric scorched at the edges, one shoulder bare, revealing mottled gray skin etched with faint bioluminescent lines that pulsed like a heartbeat. Her face was veiled, not for vanity, but because it didn't need to be seen. The Vorr that walked beside her was the reason no one moved. It wasn't a dog, wasn't any recognizable species from the registered xenobase. It looked like an 8-limbed, shadow-stitched from muscle, carbon, and something that wasn't supposed to breathe. Its eyes, 4 of them, moved independently, glowing with heat sight, depth sight, and something else entirely. Its hide absorbed light instead of reflecting. Vorrs weren't pets, they weren't even animals. They were weapons grown in biotech pits during the old Orion War, designed to wipe out entire squads before anyone could scream. The Federation classified them as Class 0 biohazards. No one survived proximity unless they were the one who'd been bonded at creation, which meant she wasn't just dangerous. She was a walking war crime. The pair moved through the bay in silence, the Vorr's claws clicking rhythmically against the metal floor, heads turning in their wake like dancers caught in a trance. She didn't speak. She didn't look at anyone. She made her way to the requisitions desk, dropped 2 blank cryo-chits with clean encoded value, no name, no rank, no DNA log, and collected protein packs, patch foam, and a single canister of plasma coolant. Then she turned and left, Vorr trailing her like death with a leash. Not a word exchanged, not a breath dared. And that should have been the end. But as the bay's lockdown re-engaged and people muttered old war prayers beneath their breath, Kalen stood there, one hand still gripping the exposed wiring in the skimmer, and realized he hadn't felt fear. He hadn't even felt surprise. He'd felt recognition. Something in the way she moved, the angle of her shoulders, the way she kept her head just slightly bowed, eyes scanning every possible exit, reminded him of himself in his worst days. Not monstrous, just tired, carrying something no one else could afford to see. He didn't tell anyone. Didn't speak her name, even though it was carved into the briefings back when they used to train soldiers to shoot anything resembling her on sight. He went back to his work, let the silence settle again. But he thought about her. That night, the storm rolled in, solar winds from a nearby microburst colliding with the outpost's failing shields, flooding the comms with static and forcing a temporary blackout. Everyone stayed indoors. Everyone but her. Kalen found her by accident while making his rounds to check emergency backups. She was outside Hangar D, in the shelter of a broken loading rig, crouched low with Vorr's massive body spread across her lap. Blood, thick, black, still steaming, pooled beneath the creature's side. He was breathing unevenly, tremors rippling beneath his armored hide. She held him tight, one hand pressed to the wound, the other fumbling with a cauterizer that had long since lost charge. She didn't look up when Kalen approached, didn't flinch when he pulled the medkit from his belt, just said, "He saved a child from a falling crate." The crate had steel rods inside. Her voice was soft, oddly neutral, as if explaining weather. Kalen knelt beside them. Vorr twitched but didn't attack. That alone said more than words. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer false comfort, just worked, cleaned the wound, applied a numbing agent, patched the broken flesh with synth seal. Vorr growled once when the gauze tightened, but let him finish. The silence between them was different this time, not cold but heavy like shared gravity. When it was done, she reached for her ration pack, pulled out a strip of dried kelp root and offered it to the beast. Vorr took it gently. She looked at Kalen then. Finally, her eyes weren't human, not in shape, not in color, silver with flickers of molten orange, but they held something heartbreakingly familiar. Exhaustion, grief. A flicker of suspicion that had nothing to do with malice and everything to do with memory. "Why?" she asked. Just that, one word. He didn't know what to say. So he said, "Because you looked like you didn't have anyone else." She didn't smile, didn't nod, just turned back to Vorr, stroked his side. "Don't help me." "Again," she said. "People who help me don't last." Then she stood. Vorr followed. The storm howled louder as if screaming her name. But she never looked back. The next time she came, it wasn't to barter supplies or treat a wound. She walked straight into Bay C like the shadows belonged to her, as if the outpost's failing. Lights and peeling walls were just background noise in a life already too loud, too sharp, too full of the weight that couldn't be shared, and it didn't matter that every pair of eyes either fled or followed her with the same shivering tension. Didn't matter that the Vorr beside her was known by name now, whispered with reverence and dread as the Void Dog, or that children had learned to stop playing near the docks when she was due, because the only place she ever looked was the maintenance platform where Kalen Dunn worked with his head down and his sleeves rolled up, grease-streaked arms, sorting spare parts like someone who needed the silence more than he needed conversation. And when she stopped beside him without a word, just standing there as if her presence alone explained the visit, he didn't pause or flinch or ask why. He just handed her a pair of insulated gloves and kept working, and she took them, knelt beside him and watched, silent and still, like a soldier returning to a battlefield long after the war had ended. It became a rhythm after that, never daily, never predictable, but steady enough that the others started noticing, and the rumors spread like rot in a vent system, that the Vorr girl had found herself a mechanic, that maybe he was under her control, maybe he wasn't really human, maybe the Vorr had scented something in him it recognized. But Kalen ignored the whispers, the snide comments, the awkward silences in the mess hall where no one sat near him anymore. Not since she started sitting across from him. Not since the Vorr curled beneath his bench like it trusted him, as if it knew something everyone else refused to see. She still didn't talk much. Sometimes she asked for parts, always rare, always essential. Sometimes she asked about the tools, but mostly she listened, to the hum of broken machinery, to the way his hands moved with precision, born from repetition and pain, to the things he didn't say about what he'd lost in the war and how every word from command still burned like acid in the back of his throat. And in turn, he didn't ask her about the scars she didn't hide, or the way her fingers sometimes trembled before they touched Vorr's fur, or the night she came in with blood on her knuckles and the look of someone who'd seen a ghost and hadn't yet decided whether to chase it or bury it. She slept in the outer docking ring on a floor mat barely large enough for her frame, Vorr curled beside her like armor in the dark. The station had empty quarters, but she didn't ask and no one offered. When the captain called Kalen into her office, she didn't waste time. "You know what she is," Leary said, her voice tight. The kind of tight that came from too many compromises and not enough peace. Zurikan defector, former Orion-class weapon handler, technically not even a citizen under current interspecies treaties. That Vorr is bonded to her on a neural link that bypasses standard controls. If it snaps, everyone here dies before we can scream. And you're sitting with her like she's a wounded animal instead of a walking bioweapon. Kalen just stared at the desk. Let her talk. Let the words roll over him like a wave that had long since eroded the shore. "You were a soldier, Dunn. Act like one, or I'll have her removed." He met her eyes then. Calm. Measured. "If you do that, she'll come back with fire, or worse. She won't, and we'll never see it coming." Leary didn't reply, just dismissed him with a silent nod, hands clenched so tight the veins stood out like cords. The next few days passed in strained quiet, the kind that lives between unspoken threats and unacknowledged truths. She didn't show up for 3 rotations. Kalen felt the absence like a missing limb. When she finally returned, she looked different. Not injured, not visibly, but there was a stillness to her now that wasn't peace, just a practiced kind of deadness, the same kind soldiers wore after a failed mission where everyone else died. She sat across from him in the service bay and said, "You patched Vorr wrong, he's limping." Kalen looked over. Vorr was favoring his left leg, barely noticeable. "He hit it well," he muttered, already pulling the med kit. She nodded once. "He always does." She watched him work in silence, then said so quietly he almost missed it, "They killed my unit. All of them. Said we were unfit to reintegrate." Kalen didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. The Federation had plenty of euphemisms for cleanup missions. She added, "They came for me next. Vorr didn't let them finish." He said nothing, just tied off the dressing. She said, "I'm tired of being followed by silence." That was the first time he offered her something without a transaction. A thermal jacket from his own locker. "Storm's coming in tonight, you'll want this." She took it, didn't say thank you, but she wore it, and that said more. The days blurred. She started helping with repairs. Small things at first, recalibrating diagnostic panels, rerouting old conduits. She had a mind built for function, not form, a soldier's precision. One afternoon as they worked on a pressure valve near the outer hull, he noticed her fingers pause for half a second before reconnecting the leads. "What's wrong?" he asked. She blinked as if realizing he'd been watching. "I used to do this with someone else, a long time ago." He didn't ask who, just handed her the next wire. She kept going. That night, when the power failed mid-cycle, plunging the eastern wing into darkness, it was she who walked Vorr into the generator room and fixed the faulty plasma regulator with barely a word. She didn't need recognition. She just needed something to do with her hands other than remember. One morning she showed up with blood on her face, not hers, but fresh, someone else's. She didn't explain. Kalen didn't ask. He just poured her coffee, bitter, recycled, almost undrinkable, and said, "Sit." She did. Vorr curled beside her, watching everyone who passed with the wary silence of a creature that had seen too much. Slowly, grudgingly, things shifted. A few crew members nodded to her in passing. One even left extra rations at her station. She didn't respond, but she didn't vanish either. And that was enough. For now. Later, when the stars burned brighter than usual and the cold pressed tighter through the outpost's aging insulation, she stayed longer after repairs. Asked questions. Real ones. "Why do you stay here?" He shrugged. "Nowhere else to go." She looked at him. Really looked. "That's not the same as choosing to stay." He sighed. "Maybe not. But sometimes we build something out of what's left. Even if it's small. Even if it doesn't last." She said nothing, but her hand brushed his wrist as she reached. For a tool, barely a touch, but deliberate. The first contact not required by function. He didn't flinch. and for the first time since she arrived, she looked like someone who wanted to believe in something again. The day she didn't show up, the air felt wrong, like the systems were breathing too fast, like the station itself knew something was missing, and Kalen tried to ignore the weight that had quietly lodged in his gut, tried to convince himself she was out scavenging again or caught in one of the dead zones beyond comm reach. But the tools lay untouched where she usually sorted them, and Vorr's shadow didn't darken the corridor by mid-cycle, and even though no one said anything, everyone noticed, because fear had turned to routine and routine had turned to quiet acceptance, and without her, something fundamental felt unanchored, as if danger itself had taken a day off, leaving behind only the echo of its usual tread. And by the second day, Kalen stopped pretending. He walked the perimeter 3 times, checked the shuttle logs, even pinged Sector 4's emergency beacons, but her signal was silent, not jammed, just deliberately off, and that silence said more than a scream. Ever could, because she was never careless, never untracked, never unaware of who might be waiting to ambush a lone Zurich in exile with a Vorr by her side. And when he finally found her 3 clicks out, crouched by the edge of the waist ridge with her hood down and her armor half torn like she'd been in a fight she barely survived, he didn't call out, didn't demand answers. He just approached slowly, Vorr rising from the rock beside her with a low rumble that ceased the second it recognized him. And then she spoke, voice raw and frayed at the edges like the wind had scraped it down. He was like you, kind, too kind. And it took Kalen a heartbeat to realize she was talking about someone else, someone long dead or close to it. He taught me to fix things, to see the cracks in the seams of a ship the way most people only see metal. And her hands, those precise killer's hands, were shaking as she pressed them flat to her knees, as if trying to remember how to ground herself without breaking. I warned him to leave before it was too late, but he stayed, and they used him to make a point. What happens to those who see past the teeth? And Kalen didn't interrupt, didn't try to soothe, because some wounds weren't meant to be sealed shut. They were meant to stay raw until they bled everything out, and all he did was sit beside her, close enough that his warmth could reach her without intruding, and the sky overhead buzzed with ion static, pink and silver like a sky trying to forget the war it had watched burn beneath it. And when she finally looked at him, there was something naked in her expression. Not vulnerability exactly, but the ghost of what used to be hope, back when she believed survival wasn't the only goal worth fighting for. She told him about the facility next, the place where they trained her, not with affection or even anger, but with the flat, hollow cadence of someone describing a place that still owned pieces of her, despite the miles she'd put between them. Rooms where children were taught to bond with Vorr packs before they could read. Places where screams were data points and comfort was weakness, where affection was used as bait and then withdrawn until the absence became the lesson. And she said, "They told us love is a delusion engineered by weaker minds." And then added with the faintest crack in her voice, "But I remember how he looked at me, like I wasn't a weapon, like I was someone who could still be more." And Kalen felt the echo of that grief, like it was his own, because he knew what it meant, to be used up by a system that called itself righteous, to have your identity flattened into something useful, efficient, disposable. They walked back in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, and both of them were better at building than explaining. So when they returned to Base C, she didn't go back to her mat in the docking ring. She followed him to his quarters, stopped just inside the door like someone unused to warmth, and Vorr padded in beside her like a shadow finally let inside after years of prowling the edges. That night she didn't sleep, not really, but she sat by the small window and watched the stars shift, her fingers tracing invisible lines between constellations that probably didn't even exist in her charts. And Kalen didn't ask her to lie down, didn't offer comfort she hadn't asked for. Instead, he sat across from her, working on a busted circuit board like it was just another quiet night. And when she finally said, "They're coming," he didn't need clarification. He knew what it meant when a past caught up to you faster than your body could outrun it. "How many?" he asked. "A full sweep team, clean and quiet. For you, for me, for Vorr, for anyone who gave us shelter." That included him, and the entire station. And she said it like a fact, not a warning. as if this was just another moment she'd accepted long before it arrived. Kalen stood. We don't have weapons here, not like what they're bringing. Then we evacuate. Leary won't leave. Then we make her. The plan wasn't much of a plan, but it was enough. She made the call to Vorr's neural channel, and the beast shimmered with aggression, ears high, ready, as if it had been waiting for this call to war since the day it was born. And she walked through the halls like a shadow dressed in flesh, telling no one what was coming but preparing them all the same, cutting off docking access, rigging the outer corridors with pressure triggers, disabling comm relays to prevent early detection. Kalen followed her lead, watching her move like a soldier who never got decommissioned, who never truly put her weapons down. And in that moment, he understood what she had meant all along, that being feared wasn't a choice, it was a sentence, one she carried like armor over a body still aching for peace. By the time the attack began, the sky had turned dark and heavy with static. 4 sleek Federation sweep ships landed without warning, silent and precise, and the soldiers that poured out weren't just mercs, they were Ghost Division, trained to erase problems without evidence, and when they breached the outer hull, Vorr was the first to strike, moving like smoke and lightning, his claws a blur of engineered violence, and the station turned into chaos and flashing lights and the kind of screams that didn't belong in places meant for maintenance and rest. Kalen stayed with her, covering her flank as she moved through the corridors like she belonged in every war she'd ever been born into, and when the captain was cornered by a sweep unit in the West Hall, it was she who pulled her clear, not gently but effectively, slamming a pressure wrench into a soldier's helmet so hard the metal dented inwards. I told you this would happen, Kalen shouted over the alarm klaxons, and I told you to stay clear of her. Leary looked at the blood on her hands, the precision with which she killed, and didn't speak. Not until later, when the last soldier fell and the ship alarms quieted and the Vorr stood over the bodies like a god of teeth in silence, and Kalen leaned against a broken support beam, breathing like the air itself was war-torn. They'll send more, Leary said, eventually. She nodded. They always do. Kalen looked at her, blood still streaked across her cheek, eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Then we make this place unwelcoming, he said. She smiled for the first time, not the kind that lit up a face, but the kind that broke it open. You'd do that? Risk this station? For me? No, he said simply. For what you're becoming. And maybe that was the moment she stopped seeing herself as just a former weapon. Maybe it was the moment she began to believe that someone could love the pieces no one else had the courage to gather. And as the stars returned to stillness and the station limped through its wounds, she didn't leave. Not because she couldn't, but because for once, someone had chosen her after seeing the monster. There was no ceremony to the morning after war, just the creak of scorched metal, the scent of ion burns clinging to the vents, and the tired shuffle of those who had survived through something they weren't built to endure. And as the station systems flickered back to life one subsystem at a time, the air felt heavier than usual, not from smoke but from everything that had been said in silence. Unspoken debts, glances that lingered too long, moments when trust was laid bare like a raw nerve and no one dared touch it. And she stood by the viewport watching the debris orbit like it was part of some slow morning ritual the universe had built from broken ships and shattered intentions. Her hands folded behind her back, her body still as Vorr rested at her feet like a coiled statue. Blood dried into its fur like metals no one wanted to acknowledge. And when Kalen approached, he didn't speak at first. He just joined her, shoulder, brushing hers, as if proximity could offer an answer neither of them had yet found. And after a long stretch of silence, she said, "They won't stop. Not with fear or dread, but with cold understanding, because she had lived long enough under the Federation's shadow to know its hunger, how it consumed what it couldn't control, and branded its survivors as anomalies to be corrected. And Kalen, still bruised from where a soldier's elbow had cracked into his jaw, nodded slowly. Then we change what they find next time, he said. And the words were simple, but their weight wasn't. Because what they both understood was that this wasn't about running anymore, or hiding, or surviving for the sake of breath alone. It was about transformation, about becoming something so rooted, so unshakably human in all its pain and defiance, that no military directive could dismantle it. And over the weeks that followed, the station shifted, not just in structure, with reinforced doors and off-grid signal scramblers, but in soul, in the way its people looked at her now, no longer with suspicion or forced tolerance, but with cautious respect. The kind born from watching someone risk everything not for themselves, but for others, and even the children who used to flinch at the sound of Vorr's growl now ran past him laughing, tossing scraps or trinkets toward his massive paws as if he were a creature from myth they no longer feared. And though she never smiled fully, there was something lighter in her movements, like she had peeled back a layer of armor and found something softer underneath, something she didn't mind letting breathe in small doses when Kalen was nearby, and it became their rhythm, him rebuilding the western docks by day, her training civilians in hand-to-hand defense by night, always circling each other, always close but never pressing too hard, as if both of them knew that love between people like them was something fragile and dangerous and holy all at once, something you didn't chase but quietly built from trust and long silences and the kind of understanding that didn't need words. And then one morning she found him by the old fusion well, hands deep in the open hatch, and before he could speak she said it finally, clearly. "I'm not afraid of what you see in me anymore." And he blinked up at her, sweat streaking his neck. Surprise mingled with something deeper in his gaze, something that ached to reach for her but respected the pain she still carried like it was stitched into her very skin. And she stepped closer, not with hesitation, but with certainty, as if she decided that if anything in her life was going to be hers by choice, it would be this. And she knelt beside him, took his hands in hers, the grease smearing into her calloused fingers like war paint, and kissed him, not with desperation or apology, but with clarity. And when their lips met, it was less an explosion and more an alignment, like two pieces of metal finally locking into place after years of wrong angles and missed timing, and neither of them spoke afterward because they didn't need to, because love, when you've been denied it long enough, doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It just is. A presence, a gravity, a quiet vow between two people who never believed they'd get to make one. And from that day forward, she stopped keeping her quarters near the shuttle bay. She moved into the old maintenance room next to Kalen's, converted it herself, reinforced the walls, kept Vorr's sleep pad at the threshold, like a living reminder that she would never fully escape the past but had chosen instead to let it guard her peace. Still, peace never lasted, not for her, not when her name was on lists and her face was in the archives as a failed asset. And less than a month after the station had returned to its new normal, the Federation sent an envoy, not soldiers, but something worse, a negotiator, polite and sterile, with a voice that smiled even when it threatened, and the offer was clear. Turn her over quietly, and the station would be left untouched, given trade leniency, maybe even protected under official orbital jurisdiction. And she listened without blinking, Vorr low and still beside her like a living sword waiting to be unsheathed. And when the man finished his speech and looked to Kalen for reason, she was the one who spoke. "You have my answer already," she said coldly. "The only question is whether you leave standing or not." And when the envoy left with false calm and thinly veiled contempt, she turned to Kalen expecting disappointment, maybe fear, but instead he simply said, "You never owed them surrender." And that night, they lay on the floor of his quarters, not speaking, just letting the quiet hold them like hands never had. And in the dark, she whispered, "I'm still learning how to be something more than what they made me." And he said, "Good," because becoming wasn't about arrival. It was about choosing every day to lean into the person you hoped to be, even when the world only ever reminded you of the monster you'd been. Time passed. Vorr aged. Kalen's shoulder never quite healed right from a final skirmish with a bounty crew, and her hair grew longer than she'd ever worn it. And sometimes, in the early hours, she'd catch herself reaching for his hand in her sleep, and instead of pulling away like reflex used to demand, she held on because love had become something instinctual, like breath, like survival, like the sound of his laugh when she threatened to rewire the whole comms array, just because someone tuned it to classical Terran opera for the third day in a row. And by the time the Federation stopped trying, because their world had moved on, their focus shifted, their obsession with her finally dulled by bureaucratic boredom and newer, shinier enemies. She no longer defined herself by what they thought of her. She was no longer a runaway project. No longer just the woman with the deadly pet. She was his. She was hers. She was something free. And sometimes, as she walked the station corridors with Vorr at her side and Kalen's voice echoing over the comms as he worked in the docks, she realized no one ran from her anymore. They nodded. They smiled. They welcomed. Because what she had once been feared for, her teeth, her strength, her wrath, had become the very things they trusted her to wield in their defense. And when Kalen took her hand before the cycle festival and whispered, "You know I love you, right?" She didn't flinch or freeze or deflect. She just smiled back softly, slowly, like the universe had finally stopped punishing her for being loved.